Montana, 1876. A land buried under snow, silence, and secrets people learned not to name out loud. On the edge of town stood the Donnelly farmhouse. From a distance it looked ordinary, but those who lived nearby swore something followed that family, something that moved quietly from one generation to the next. People noticed patterns. Children who thought alike, mistakes that repeated themselves, choices that felt inherited rather than learned. Bodies were found over the years, questions were asked, yet proof never lasted long enough to survive daylight. Every time the truth felt close, it slipped back into silence, as if the land itself was protecting the Donnelly name. The real question was never what the Donnellys did. The real question was far more unsettling. Are some people shaped by darkness, or are they born already carrying it? Disclaimer. This story is a work of complete fiction. Any resemblance to real people, families, or events is purely coincidental. This narrative is written solely for creative storytelling and suspense. Chapter 1. The Quiet Land of Montana. Montana, 1876. This was a place where sound felt out of place. Snow covered the ground like a burial sheet, softening footsteps and swallowing echoes. During the day, people worked, traded, and nodded politely. At night, doors locked early, and no one lingered where the dark could listen. At the edge of town, where farmland met forest, stood the Donnelly farmhouse. Wooden walls, a smoking chimney, a barn leaning slightly from age. Nothing about it looked threatening, and yet no one passed it after sunset unless they had no other choice. Old townsfolk used to say, "That house remembers things." Patrick Donnelly was the man of the house. Tall, quiet and controlled. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened, not because of volume, but because of certainty. His eyes held a calm that felt practiced, like something carefully learned over time. His wife, Margaret Donnelly, filled the home with routine, cooking, cleaning, sewing late into the night, but behind her steady movements was a weariness that never fully left her face. She smiled when spoken to, yet her eyes always seemed somewhere else. And then there were the children. That was where people started feeling uneasy. Other children laughed loudly, scraped their knees and cried without shame. The Donnelly children watched, they listened, they learned, too carefully. They rarely asked questions, but when they did, they sounded older than they were. One evening the youngest asked his father, "If a mistake keeps happening, does it stop being a mistake?" Patrick didn't answer. He simply stared into the fire until the flames settled. People noticed lights burning late inside the Donnelly home, shadows moving where none should be, footsteps heard at hours when everyone should have been asleep. And yet, by morning, everything returned to normal. The town sherry. F once said, "The Donnellys show up more in whispers than in reports." But whispers have weight, and some stories don't need proof to leave scars. This chapter is only the beginning, the land, the family, the silence, because soon the Donnelly name would become tied to something the town could no longer ignore. Next we discover how one small incident pulled the Donnelly family into public attention for the first time, and the early sign that whatever lived with them was no longer willing to stay hidden. Chapter 2. The First Crack in Silence. The first thing that broke the town's quiet wasn't a scream. It was a missing horse. On a cold morning just before sunrise, Henry Walsh, one of the town's oldest farmers, found his stable door open. The rope that held his best horse had been cleanly untied. No blood, no struggle, just empty space where a living thing had been the night before. At first, people shrugged it off. Horses wandered sometimes, but this one didn't wander back. 2 days later, tracks were found near the tree line. They didn't lead toward the hills or the river like most runaway animals did. They led toward the Donnelly farmland, then disappeared completely, right where the ground turned hard and dark. Henry didn't accuse anyone, not out loud, but he stopped looking. That's when people started paying attention. Whispers moved faster than the winter wind. Someone remembered a night when they saw the Donnelly boys standing near the fence, watching the road long after dark. Someone else recalled hearing unfamiliar movement near the barn, slow, careful sounds that didn't belong to animals. When the sheriff came by the Donnelly house, Patrick welcomed him inside with the same calm expression he always wore. The kitchen was warm. The children sat quietly, too quietly. No one seemed nervous. The sheriff asked simple questions. Patrick answered simply. No lies, no visible hesitation, nothing that could be written down. And yet, as the sheriff stepped back into the cold, he felt something he couldn't explain, a sense that the visit had been expected. That same week, the river gave up something it had been holding. A bundle of cloth snagged on a fallen branch near the bank. Inside it were riding straps Henry Walsh recognized instantly, still intact, clean, almost carefully placed. Now the whispers grew louder. Some townsfolk said it was coincidence. Others said it was theft. But a few, usually the ones who stayed silent the longest, said something else entirely. They said patterns don't begin loudly. They begin quietly, when no one wants to notice. The Donnelly children became a topic of conversation at the general store. How they stared, how they mirrored each other's movements, how one child finished another's sentence without looking. Kids learn from their home, someone said. Another replied, or they learn what their home carries. If you're listening to this story right now, stay with it, because moments like this, the small ones people ignore, are where everything starts changing. What comes next won't arrive suddenly. It will arrive carefully. By the time winter deepened, the Donnelly name was no longer just a whisper. It had become a pause in conversation, a look held too long, a feeling no one wanted to explain. And still, no one could prove a thing. Not yet. Next, we discover how a single decision inside the Donnelly household triggered a chain that could not be undone, and why the town's silence may have been its greatest mistake. Chapter 3. Inside the Donnelly walls. What the town didn't see was what happened after the doors of the Donnelly farmhouse closed. Inside, the house felt warmer than it should have. The fire burned low but steady, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Patrick sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Margaret moved quietly, setting plates down with careful precision. No one spoke. Silence inside the Donnelly home wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, almost respected. The children sat together, close but not touching. They didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. Their eyes drifted, not toward their parents, but toward each other, as if waiting for a shared signal. Finally, Patrick spoke. The sheriff came today. Margaret paused, then continued arranging the dishes. Yes, she said calmly. I know. The children's expressions didn't change. No surprise, no fear, just attention. Patrick leaned back slightly. The town is starting to notice. One of the boys tilted his head. They always notice, just slowly. Margaret's hands froze for a moment before she forced them to move again. She didn't correct him. She never did. This was how things had always been handled in the Donnelly family, not through panic or raised voices, but through understanding, quiet alignment, agreement without discussion. That night, after the lamps were dimmed, Patrick walked the length of the house, checking locks that didn't need checking. In the children's room, he paused. They were already awake. You remember what matters, he said. The oldest nodded. We don't act first. And if we do? Patrick asked. We make sure there's no noise left behind. Patrick stood there longer than necessary, then closed the door gently. Margaret waited for him in the kitchen. She didn't ask questions. She never had. She simply said, The land remembered. Says things too. Patrick met her gaze. Only if we let it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the house like a warning no one planned to answer. The next morning, the children walked into town together. People noticed how closely they stayed aligned. Same pace, same expressions. When spoken to, they were polite. When stared at, they didn't react at all. That unsettled people more than rudeness ever could. If you're following this story, don't step away now, because this is where lines stop being clear. The Donnellys weren't hiding in panic. They were preparing, and preparation, when done patiently, looks an awful lot like calm. By the end of that week, something shifted. Not in the town records, not in public conversation. But inside the Donnelly house, a decision had been made. And decisions, once shared, don't stay contained for long. Next, we discover how a quiet family moment led to consequences no one outside the Donnelly bloodline could predict, and why the children would soon be seen not as observers, but participants. Chapter 4. A pattern no one wanted to name. By early spring, the snow around Montana had begun to thin, revealing ground that looked older than it should have. Mud replaced ice, and with it came tracks, footprints, wagon marks, and signs people could no longer pretend not to see. It started with a broken fence. A farmer on the East Road found several posts torn loose overnight, not smashed, not rushed, removed carefully, as if someone had taken the time to avoid making noise. The fence bordered land that edged close to the Donnelly property. No one said their name at first, but people looked toward that farmhouse more often now. The sheriff returned to asking questions, not officially, just casual visits, conversations that began with weather and ended without resolution. Each time, Patrick Donnelly stood firm and polite. Each time, Margaret watched from behind him, her expression unreadable. Inside the house, the children were learning something new. Patrick had begun teaching them patience, not in words, but in practice. He showed them how waiting could be more effective than acting, how stillness created doubt, how doubt protected those who stayed silent. People fill silence with their own fears, he told them one evening. Let them. The children listened. They always did. Out in town, the general store buzzed with low conversation. Someone claimed they'd seen one of the Donnelly boys out late, standing near the riverbank. Another insisted it must have been someone else. Arguments didn't form, only discomfort. No one wanted to be the first to accuse, and that hesitation mattered. If you're still listening, this is the part most stories rush past. But real changes don't arrive in chaos. They arrive in moments where nothing seems urgent, until later. That same week, a traveler passing through town disappeared. No name was ever written down. No family came, looking. Just an empty room at the boarding house and a meal left untouched. The river ran quietly that night. Inside the Donnelly home, Margaret sat awake long after everyone else slept. She stared at her hands, as if they held memories she didn't remember choosing. When Patrick came to sit beside her, she didn't pull away. "This wasn't how it started," she said softly. Patrick didn't deny it. "But it's how it continues." The children slept soundly, or pretended to. By now, the Donnelly name carried weight, too heavy to lift, too dangerous to drop. People adjusted their routes, their glances, their conversations. Nothing could be proven, but nothing felt accidental anymore. The land had begun connecting dots the town refused to draw. Next we discover how one unexpected witness forced the Donnelly family into a position they could no longer avoid, and why silence, for the first time, began to crack. Chapter 5. The one who watched too closely. His name was Elijah Moore, and he didn't belong to Montana. That much was clear the moment he arrived. Elijah came from the east, carrying little more than a worn coat and a habit of noticing things others overlooked. He stayed at the boarding house, spoke politely, and asked questions that sounded harmless at first. "How long has that family lived out there? Does the river always run that quiet?" People seemed careful with their words here. Most townsfolk answered vaguely. Some laughed it off. A few changed the subject entirely. because Elijah asked about the Donnellys. He first noticed them on his third day in town. The children were standing near the general store, not buying anything, not talking, just watching the road. Elijah slowed his steps, pretending to adjust his coat. The children's eyes followed him, but their expressions didn't change. Not curiosity, not fear. Assessment. That unsettled him more than hostility would have. Later that evening, Elijah walked closer to the Donnelly land than he should have. He told himself he was just stretching his legs, but when he stopped at the tree line, he realized he was listening, waiting for a sound he couldn't explain. What he heard instead was movement, careful, measured, too deliberate for animals. A figure passed near the barn, then another. Elijah didn't stay long enough to be seen, or so he believed. The next day, Patrick Donnelly came into town for supplies. He paused briefly beside Elijah at the counter. "You're new," Patrick said calmly. Elijah nodded. "Passing through." Patrick met his eyes. "That's usually wise." The words were polite. The meaning wasn't. If you're still with this story, remember this moment. Because history doesn't always turn on loud events. It turns on small exchanges that leave impressions no one can shake. Elijah should have left town the next morning. He told himself that. Instead, he stayed. That night, the riverbank changed. Elijah was there when he saw it. Fresh marks in the mud. Not footprints exactly. Drag marks. Recent. Leading from the water toward the fields and stopping abruptly. Too abruptly. He backed away slowly. Every instinct told him he was standing at the edge of something already decided. By the time he reached the road, the Donnelly farmhouse was lit. One window, then another, like eyes opening. Inside that house, the children were awake again. "They're watching us now," one of them said. Patrick's voice was calm. "Then we wait." Margaret said nothing, but her hands trembled for the first time in years. Elijah didn't sleep that night. By morning, he was gone. No farewell, no explanation, just an empty room and a single thought left behind in the town's silence. Someone finally saw too much. Next, we discover what Elijah Moore wrote down before he vanished, and why those words refused to stay hidden, and how the Donnelly pattern began turning against itself. Chapter 6. Words that refuse to sink. Elijah Moore did not disappear quietly. 2 days after he left town, the boarding house owner found something tucked beneath the loose floorboard of his room. It wasn't valuable. No money. No letters. Just a small leather-bound notebook. At first, no one wanted to open it. People in Montana had learned that some things were safer left untouched, but curiosity has its own gravity, and eventually, the sheriff took the book. The pages were neat, careful, written by someone who wanted to be understood. Elijah had been documenting patterns, dates, times, locations, observations that seemed harmless on their own, but together they told a story that unsettled everyone who read it. He wrote about the Donnelly children appearing in places they didn't belong, about lights turning on in the farmhouse at identical hours across different nights, about tracks that vanished without explanation. Most disturbing of all was one repeated line. They move as if they already know what comes next. The sheriff read the notebook alone at first. Then he showed it to 2 others. By the third reading, the room felt smaller. Still, nothing in those pages could be called proof. Just attention. Just detail. Just the kind of careful watching most people avoided. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick sensed the shift before anyone spoke of it. There was tension in the air, subtle but undeniable. "They're holding on to something," he told Margaret. She nodded. Words last longer than silence. That night, the children gathered around the table. Patrick explained that when stories escaped control, they had to be redirected. "We don't erase," he said. "We outlast." If you're still listening, this is where the Donnellys' confidence begins to test itself, because silence works best when no one is writing things down. In town, the notebook passed hand to hand. Each reader grew quieter than the last. No accusations were made aloud, but people stopped meeting the Donnellys' eyes. Conversations ended when footsteps approached. The land felt watchful now, less patient. Margaret stood at the window one evening, staring toward the river. "What if this time," she asked quietly, "we're the ones being remembered?" Patrick didn't answer. By the end of the week, the notebook was returned to the sheriff's desk, but the ideas it planted stayed alive, shared in glances, in half-finished sentences, in fear that no longer needed names. And for the first time, the Donnelly family felt something unfamiliar pressing against them. Resistance. Next, we discover how the town's growing awareness forced the Donnelly children into a role they were never meant to play publicly, and why inherited patterns don't always survive exposure. Chapter 7. When children are no longer invisible. The shift happened quietly, but it was unmistakable. For the first time, the Donnelly children were no longer overlooked. At the schoolhouse, desks that once sat empty beside them now stayed deliberately vacant. Other children whispered, then stopped when one of the Donnellys glanced their way. Teachers noticed how often the siblings answered questions before they were called on, never competing, never overlapping, as if they'd already decided who would speak. It unsettled people. The sheriff began paying attention to where the children went after lessons ended. They always took the same path, always together, always home before dusk, perfectly predictable. Too predictable. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick addressed it plainly. "They're watching you now," he said. "That means you do less, not more." The children listened, but something had changed. Awareness brings pressure, and pressure demands release. Margaret noticed it first, the smallest signs. One child stayed awake later than usual. Another stared too long at the road from the window. They were restless, like something contained for too long. "You're asking too much of them," she said quietly. Patrick didn't look away. "I'm asking what was always asked." That night, one of the children didn't come straight home. It was only minutes, 5, maybe 10. But when the door finally opened, Patrick knew immediately, not from guilt, from confidence. "Where were you?" he asked. The child met his eyes. "Walking?" Patrick studied him, then nodded. No punishment, no lecture. But something fundamental cracked. If you're still listening, understand this. Patterns don't fail all at once. They fail in moments when someone tests how far they can go and discovers the answer isn't 0. The next day, someone reported seeing a Donnelly child near the river alone. That hadn't happened before. The sheriff wrote it down. Just one line, just in case. In town, fear shifted shape. It was no longer vague or distant. It had a face now, or several. Margaret stood in the kitchen that evening, gripping the counter. "They're being seen," she said. "This ends badly." Patrick's voice was firm. "It ends when we say it does." But the children heard everything. Later that night, whispers moved through the house, not from outside, but within. Plans weren't spoken aloud, yet understanding passed between them effortlessly. The inherited pattern was still there. But now it was evolving. By morning, the town would wake to something new, something undeniable, something that would force everyone, including the Donnellys, to react. And reactions are harder to control than silence. Next, we discover the incident at the river that pushed suspicion into the open for the first time, and why the town could no longer pretend it was imagining things. Chapter 8. The River That Spoke. Spring had begun to thaw Montana, and the river ran faster than it had all winter. Meltwater carried broken branches and leaves downstream, like the land was trying to wash itself clean. It was there, along the riverbank, that the first undeniable incident occurred. A fisherman returning late in the evening spotted movement near the water. At first he thought it was an animal. Then he saw the figures, 2 of the Donnelly children. They were crouched near the edge, hands outstretched, eyes fixed on something in the water. The man called out, and one child froze. The other did not. Both stared back, unmoving, calm, and eerily unafraid. He noticed their reflection in the river, and for a moment it seemed wrong, like the water mirrored not only their forms but their intent. By the time he approached, whatever had been in the water was gone. Only a trail of disturbed mud remained. The fisherman left quickly, but he didn't forget. No one did. Word travelled faster than usual. The town gathered whispers. The children had been seen at the river alone. Some claimed to have seen movement in the shadows. Others insisted it was imagination. But by then, imagination had grown uncomfortable wings. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick and Margaret were waiting. They already knew. The children arrived, silent, and went straight to their rooms. No explanation, no apology, nothing that could hint at the control they exercised so naturally. Margaret spoke softly to Patrick. "The town is beginning to watch us like we're the story itself." Patrick nodded. "And it may be true, but watching is not understanding. If you're still listening, this is the moment that changes everything. Patterns that once lived quietly now cast shadows across the town, and every observer suddenly feels the weight of those shadows." Later that evening, the sheriff came by, walking slowly along the riverbank. He saw the tracks. Clear, human, but precise. Too careful to belong to careless children. He looked toward the Donnelly house, windows glowing against the dusk. Something inside seemed to acknowledge him. Inside, Patrick whispered to the children, "The world is noticing. You must not." The children understood immediately. No further instructions were needed. The town's curiosity had turned into attention. Attention was a dangerous thing, and Montana, quiet and patient for so long, now held its breath. Next, we discover how the sheriff's investigation begins pressing the Donnellys to act, and why a single misstep might expose the entire pattern, and why even the smallest observer can change everything. Chapter 9. The Sheriff's Pressure. The sheriff's presence had become a constant weight in the town, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because his questions lingered. They floated in doorways, markets, and the quiet streets like invisible reminders. Someone was watching. Patrick Donnelly noticed it immediately. He had been patient for years, teaching the children how to move without leaving traces, how to speak without saying too much. But now the town itself pressed in. Curiosity had grown into suspicion, and suspicion demanded answers. One morning, the sheriff appeared at the Donnelly farmhouse before sunrise. His boots crunched over frost-hardened ground, and when he knocked, the sound echoed across the silent fields. Patrick opened the door. "Sheriff?" "Morning, Patrick," he said, evenly. "I have a few questions about the river, about the children, about things people have noticed." Patrick gestured for him inside. "Come in. I'll answer what I can." Inside, Margaret moved quietly, preparing coffee, her eyes alert. The children stood nearby, watching, not interfering, just observing. Their presence alone made the sheriff shift uncomfortably. "The tracks along the riverbank," the sheriff began, "and reports of the children being alone. I need to understand what's happening." Patrick's voice was calm. "The children are never truly alone. They learn to notice, and the land teaches more than people realize." The sheriff paused. "You don't take this seriously, do you?" Patrick tilted his head slightly. "We take it very seriously, but perhaps differently than you do." The sheriff left with no more questions, only unease, but he did not walk away quietly. The town could sense his tension. For the first time, whispers turned into meetings. The people of Montana, who had tolerated the Donnellys' silence, were now forming opinions that could no longer be ignored. That night, Patrick spoke to the children in the dim light of the kitchen. "The sheriff will be here again. He watches for patterns. You must not give him any. Understand?" They nodded, as they always did. But something in their expressions was new. Alertness laced with something almost cautious. Margaret leaned in. "Do you think they'll stop at watching?" Patrick did not answer. Outside, the wind stirred the trees like whispering voices. Even the house seemed to listen. If you're still following this story, understand this. Patterns only fail when they are observed too closely. And right now, the town was observing. The sheriff was observing. And even the smallest mistake could unravel years of careful control. By the next day, the tension had spread. The children moved differently at school, careful not to be noticed. The adults whispered, careful not to be overheard. And the river ran, as if it knew the stakes had changed. The Donnellys' silence had lasted decades, but now the world was asking questions they could not ignore. Next, we discover how the children are forced to make a decision that could either protect their family or destroy it, and why even perfect patterns can be disrupted by a single observer. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. The town had changed. What once had been quiet curiosity had become focused tension. Every glance toward the Donnelly farmhouse carried suspicion. Every footstep near the river was noted. Every child's movement analyzed. The sheriff returned that morning, not with questions, but with intent. He came with a notebook in hand, scribbled observations from townsfolk, names, dates, sightings, all recorded. His eyes were sharper, and his steps more deliberate. Patrick watched him from the porch. Margaret followed silently behind. The children, as usual, stayed at the edges, observing, learning. But even they felt it. The town's patience was running out. The sheriff stepped closer. "Patrick, this has gone far enough. People are talking about what they see near the river, near your house. I'm asking you to explain it, or I'll have to take action." Patrick's voice was low, measured. "You see patterns, Sheriff, but patterns are not crimes." The sheriff's lips tightened. "When patterns frighten people, they become matters of concern. You understand that, don't you?" Inside, the children watched. The oldest nodded subtly, as if hearing a signal Patrick never spoke aloud. Outside, the town waited, tension held in murmurs and sidelong glances. That evening, the children were alone for a short walk near the river. The current had strengthened, carrying debris downstream. One of them reached out and touched the water, fingers breaking the reflection of the clouds. The ripple spread, distorting shapes that had seemed solid. "Everything changes if we move too early," the oldest whispered. "Yes," the younger agreed, "but waiting isn't forever." Back at the farmhouse, Patrick and Margaret sat in silence. Neither spoke. Both understood. The town's pressure was no longer subtle. It demanded action. And action, no matter how controlled, carried risk. If you're still listening, this is the moment tension shifts into motion. Patterns alone don't cause fear. Exposure does. And the Donnelly children, trained to observe and wait, were about to be forced into a choice that could ripple through Montana like a sudden storm. That night, the town's whispers reached a fever pitch. Rumors of shadows by the river, odd behavior near the house, and the Donnelly children's uncanny timing filled conversations in every household. People who had once shrugged began walking differently, watching differently, thinking differently. Inside, the family huddled briefly. Patrick's eyes scanned each child. "You know what to do," he said. "Yes," they answered in unison, calm but deliberate. The first step had been taken, and once it began, the river would no longer flow quietly. Next, we discover how the first public confrontation changes everything, and why the Donnellys' careful plan might unravel in a single evening, and why the town may finally understand that silence is no longer an option.
Did you know, in the summer of 1876, one of the most famous battles in American frontier history took place in what was then the Montana Territory? On June 25-26, 1876, The Battle of the Little Bighorn occurred between the United States Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and a combined force of Lakota, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Custer had been ordered to compel Native American bands to return to their reservations, but instead of waiting for reinforcements, he divided his command and launched a direct attack on a large encampment. The tribes, led by chiefs such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, decisively defeated Custer's battalion, resulting in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. This battle was part of the larger Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877, a series of conflicts over territory, treaties, and resistance to forced relocation by the United States. Why this matters for your story. This historic conflict highlights the real tension and danger in Montana in 1876, a period of struggle, fear, and uncertainty among settlers and native tribes alike. Even though your Donnelly story is fictional, placing it against this backdrop gives your narrative authentic historical weight and context.
Chapter 11. The First Confrontation. The town had waited long enough. It started with one man at the riverbank, lantern in hand. He'd watched the Donnelly children too closely for too long, and tonight curiosity overcame caution. He called out, voice echoing over the water, "Hey, what are you doing out here?" The children froze, not from fear, but calculation, their heads tilted slightly as if reading something in the man's stance, the tremor in his hands. One of the younger children stepped forward. "We're just watching," they said softly, words carefully chosen. "The river moves fast tonight." The man laughed nervously, unsure whether to take them seriously. "You shouldn't be here alone." "We know," the eldest replied, "but sometimes watching is safer than leaving." That simple sentence made the man step back. There was something in their tone, calm, unshakable, almost deliberate. And then he saw it. A shadow in the water that mirrored the children's movements perfectly, a ripple that didn't belong to the current. Fear gripped him. He ran to the sheriff, words tumbling out too fast to organize. By morning, half the town had gathered near the river, murmuring anxiously. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick and Margaret observed from the windows. The children had returned silently, knowing the town's gaze would be heavier now. Patrick leaned close to Margaret. "They forced their hand," he said softly, "but it's manageable." Margaret frowned. "Manageable?" "Yes," Patrick replied. "For now. If you're still listening, this is where control meets exposure." The town's eyes had pierced the Donnelly's silence, and once noticed, nothing can stay hidden. Even the smallest mistake can cascade. The sheriff spoke to Patrick later that day. "Your children have been seen out there, alone. The town is concerned. I need assurance that nothing improper is happening." Pause. Trick's calm reply. "They learn by observing. Nothing improper occurs under my roof." The sheriff's jaw tightened, and he left, but the unease lingered. For the first time, the town understood that the Donnellys were not just quiet. They were deliberate. That night, the children gathered in the kitchen. "They're coming closer," the eldest whispered. "Yes," said the younger one. "We need to respond. Carefully." The family's plan, honed over decades, now faced its first public test. The town's curiosity had shifted into scrutiny. Scrutiny demanded answers, and the children were learning to deliver them without revealing too much. By the river, the current continued to move, carrying leaves, debris, and attention. The town's fear was tangible, a pulse in the cold air. And the Donnellys, they were ready, calm, patient, observing. Next, we discover how the first public challenge forces the Donnellys to act, and why even the slightest hesitation could change everything. And why patterns, once exposed, may take on a life of their own. Chapter 12. Moves in the Shadows. The first public confrontation had passed, but the tension lingered like smoke over the town. Inside the Donnelly farmhouse, Patrick paced quietly, measuring the walls, the windows, the doors. Every creak, every shift in the floorboards mattered. Margaret moved among the children, her hands steady, but her eyes sharp. The children had learned quickly. Exposure demanded action, not rash action, careful, deliberate action. "We can't let them think they see everything," Patrick said softly. "Control what you show. Make them doubt what they don't." The eldest nodded. "We move only when necessary, always together." Outside, the town remained restless. The sheriff's eyes lingered on the farmhouse longer than usual. Neighbors whispered about shadows, fleeting figures glimpsed behind curtains, lights burning at odd hours. The Donnellys were no longer invisible. That night, the children practiced, quietly, deliberately, movement from room to room, footsteps measured, voices hushed. They had to learn how to be seen without revealing intent. If you're following this story closely, this is where the slow burn becomes a spark. Observation alone is no longer enough. Action begins, and every choice carries weight. By the river, patterns shifted. The children moved among the reeds, placing small markers only they could recognize. They weren't hiding, they were setting boundaries. Observers would notice movement, but they would never fully understand the design. Margaret whispered to Patrick, "They're learning too fast. I fear they may surpass us." Patrick's eyes did not waver. "Then we guide them carefully. Every step, every pause, every glance. They will do as we say." The sheriff returned that week, notebook in hand. He had seen something the town had not noticed. Subtle signs of movement near the river at dawn, too precise to be coincident. He asked questions again, but Patrick's calm answers only fueled the sheriff's suspicion. "Watchful families breed patterns," Patrick said, voice measured. "Not secrets. Watch carefully. You may see what you expect, but never the whole truth." The sheriff left with unease. Montana's air felt heavier than usual, charged with anticipation. The town had seen, but they hadn't understood, and that misunderstanding was the Donnellys' advantage. Inside, the children huddled. "Tomorrow," the eldest whispered, "we take the first step they can notice and misinterpret." "Yes," the younger agreed. "We show them something they cannot control." If you're still listening, this is where suspense begins to ripple outward. The Donnellys' calculated world is intersecting with the town's curiosity. Once exposure starts, patterns can shift, and no one, not even those who created them, can fully predict the consequences. By the end of the night, the farmhouse was still. The children slept, but their minds were already in motion. The river, the town, the sheriff, everything was being watched. Everything was being set. Next, we discover the first deliberate move the Donnellys make under scrutiny, and how the town reacts in ways no one expects, and why even a family that controls its pattern can face chaos when the world interferes. Chapter 13. The pattern emerges. By now, the town could no longer pretend it was merely observing the Donnellys. Reports of strange movements near the river and flickering lights at odd hours had multiplied. People whispered in doorways, in the general store, and on the dusty roads. Something was happening, and it was no longer subtle. Inside the farmhouse, Patrick, Margaret, and the children had anticipated this moment. Their patience had been long, their timing precise. Tonight, they were ready to act. The eldest child led the siblings outside under the veil of darkness. They moved silently, their footsteps calculated to blend with the rustle of leaves and the distant flow of the river. Markers they had placed earlier guided their path, ensuring that each step created a pattern visible only to careful observers, one that suggested presence, absence, and misdirection all at once. Meanwhile, in town, a few of the bolder residents, spurred by curiosity and fear, decided to investigate. They crept toward the river, lanterns in hand, hearts pounding. What they saw made them freeze. Shadows moved with uncanny precision, mirroring human actions, but never fully revealing themselves. The sheriff, following the reports, arrived shortly after. He observed silently, notebook ready, but the signs were already layered. Tracks led here, then vanished. Ripples in the water distorted reality. The children appeared, then disappeared, leaving the adults uncertain whether they had truly seen anything at all. Inside the farmhouse, Patrick watched from a window. "They see," he said, voice calm, "but they don't understand." Margaret glanced at him, tension in her eyes. "And if they try to interpret it?" Patrick's gaze never wavered. "Then we let them misread. Their assumptions are more useful than their knowledge. If you're following this story, pay attention now. The Donnellys have created a visible pattern, one the town can notice but cannot control. Observation without understanding is dangerous. It breeds fear, and fear shapes behavior faster than any law can. By the river, the residents began whispering to each other, confusion mingling with dread. What had seemed like coincidence or childlike mischief now took on deliberate form. Every ripple, every shadow, every calculated pause seemed purposeful. The children returned quietly to the house. Patrick met their eyes. "Step 1, he said. "Yes," the eldest replied. "They are seeing the surface, not the depth." The house settled into its usual quiet, but the tension remained. Outside, the town's curiosity had escalated to unease. Inside, the Donnellys were calm, but poised. Their plan was moving, and the world was unknowingly participating. Next, we discover how the town begins to react to the Donnellys' deliberate patterns, and why even careful families can feel the pressure of suspicion, and how observation can start to unravel control. Chapter 14. The Weight of Suspicion. The town's unease had grown heavy enough to touch. Conversations in the general store were hushed. Glances toward the Donnelly farmhouse lingered just a little too long. Even the adults who once ignored strange occurrences found themselves whispering at doorways and windows. The sheriff, notebook in hand, returned again. His calm exterior could no longer mask the tension behind his eyes. He had begun connecting dots, tracks, river ripples, and the children's uncanny movements. But every lead dissolved before it could form proof. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick moved quietly from room to room, observing, calculating. Margaret tended the fire, her hands steady but her mind racing. The children sat nearby, alert, absorbing every nuance of the house, the creaks, the shadows, the faintest hints of movement outside. "They're testing patience," Patrick said softly. Margaret frowned. "And what if patience runs out?" "It won't," he replied. "Not yet. But they are pushing boundaries, carefully, but deliberately." That night the children walked along the riverbank. They had learned the town was watching. Every movement was precise, every pause intentional. They left signs the town could see but could not interpret, a trail of clues designed to mislead, confuse, and instill doubt. If you're still listening, understand this. Fear thrives on uncertainty. The Donnellys' patterns were clever, but the more the town noticed, the more pressure mounted. Observation can twist perception, and perception shapes action. By morning, the town's conversations had escalated. People were speaking openly about the Donnellys. Questions of morality, curiosity, and suspicion mixed together in anxious tones. Some even wondered if something unnatural had settled in the family over generations. Inside the farmhouse, Patrick gathered the children. "They are speaking openly now," he said. "The first cracks appear in their confidence. We must be ready." The eldest child nodded. "We show them enough to keep their focus, but never enough to satisfy it." Margaret watched silently, tension coiled in her shoulders. She knew the next few days would demand more from them than ever before. The sheriff returned later that afternoon, notebook and lantern in hand. He noticed shadows, the subtle movements along the riverbank, and a fleeting reflection in the water that did not belong to him. He scribbled notes furiously, sensing that the pattern was growing, but still eluding him. The children had observed all of it. When they returned to the house, no words were exchanged. Their understanding was complete. They had begun to feel the weight of suspicion themselves, even as they controlled the narrative. Patrick stood by the window, watching the town's activities, calm but vigilant. They think they see, but they are only seeing what we allow. Outside, the wind carried voices across the frozen ground. Inside, the house remained still, but tension hummed like an electric current. Next, we discover how one small misstep by the town forces the Donnellys to escalate their plan, and why silence can only protect for so long, and how suspicion begins to shape both the watchers and the watched. Chapter 15. The First Danger. The river had become a mirror, not of water, but of attention. Every ripple reflected a town growing bolder, a curiosity that had begun to demand answers. One evening, a group of local teenagers decided to test the stories. They crept to the riverbank near the Donnelly property, daring each other to approach the shadows they had only glimpsed from afar. Their laughter was low, forced, masking unease. The children of the Donnelly family noticed immediately. Hidden in the reeds, they observed the intruders, calculating, precise. Their footsteps were measured, their presence deliberate, yet invisible. One teenager slipped on the muddy bank. The sound was small, but to the Donnellys, it carried meaning. Patrick whispered to the eldest child, "They are stepping too close. Intervene subtly. Do not frighten more than necessary." The eldest nodded, understanding without instruction. A careful movement, a shadow, a reflection in the river that made the teenagers doubt what they had seen. They stumbled backward, uneasy. No harm done, but fear planted. If you're following this story, notice this. Control isn't about stopping action. It's about shaping perception. The Donnellys' subtle influence could make witnesses question their own senses. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret watched from the window. Her hands rested lightly on the sill, but her mind was tense. The balance between observation and exposure was fragile. One misstep, one loud mistake, could provoke the very chaos they had been avoiding. The teenagers fled, whispering to one another, convinced they had glimpsed something supernatural. The town's gossip network accelerated, feeding the sheriff more stories, more questions. Patrick gathered the children in the kitchen. "They have felt it now," he said, "the first taste of what they cannot control. Remember, fear is more useful than pro." Margaret leaned close. "And if they push harder?" Patrick's voice was calm. "Then we push too, but carefully. Every move counts. No one can see everything, except us." Outside, Montana's cold night carried the town's whispers to the farmhouse walls. The sheriff paced, frustrated. Notes and observations filled his notebook, yet clarity remained just out of reach. Inside, the children trained their minds on the patterns, the reflections, the invisible rules of movement that Patrick had taught them. Observation had become a weapon, and knowledge their shield. By morning, the town's unease had deepened. Fear was no longer vague. It had a shape, a rhythm. People avoided the riverbank. Conversations stuttered. The Donnellys' control extended silently, invisibly. And still, no one could prove a thing. Next, we discover how the Donnellys turn fear into a tool, and why the town begins reacting in ways the family could not fully anticipate, and how one small misstep could trigger a chain that can't be stopped. Chapter 16. Fear becomes a tool. The town was no longer watching passively. Whispers had become speculation. Speculation had become plans, and those plans were messy, emotional, human, driven by fear more than reason. People avoided the riverbank, slowed their steps near the Donnelly house, and whispered at doors, careful not to be overheard. Inside the Donnelly farmhouse, Patrick observed it all like a conductor of invisible strings. The children moved through the house with purpose, as if following the rhythm of the town's anxiety. Every glance, every subtle gesture reinforced what Patrick had taught. Fear, once understood, could be guided. Margaret joined him near the window. "They're slipping into chaos," she said softly. "Do you think we've gone too far?" Patrick's eyes never left the town's distant lights. "Too far? We've merely revealed the edges of what they fear. Chaos begins outside only when they decide to act. For now, we lead it." That night, the eldest child left the house under Patrick's careful supervision. A single lantern floated along the riverbank, casting shadows that moved unnaturally, reflecting more than light, mirroring shapes that weren't there. A few townsfolk happened upon it, and their reactions were immediate: startled gasps, hurried footsteps, whispered exclamations. The illusion was enough. If you're following the story closely, pay attention here. Perception is stronger than reality. The Donnellys had learned to manipulate it subtly, making their observers question their senses, even their sanity. By morning, the sheriff received dozens of reports: shadows at the river, figures in the reeds, lights that shifted across windows. He scribbled notes frantically, but clarity remained elusive. Even the adults in town began doubting what they had seen. Inside the farmhouse, Patrick addressed the children. Notice how they react. Fear is the only proof they can give themselves. We use it wisely, never recklessly. The children nodded. They were learning that their influence extended beyond physical space. They had control over perception, attention, and the pattern of expectation. Margaret whispered, "Do you think it's right?" Patrick didn't answer. The question had no practical value in this moment. Survival, strategy, and control were what mattered. By afternoon, the town had begun to shift. People avoided certain paths, moved differently near the river, and altered routines they had followed for years. Every small misstep reinforced the Donnellys' invisible authority. Even so, tension hung thickly in the air. The town was beginning to push back, in subtle, indirect ways, testing limits, probing boundaries. Every observer was also a participant now, and each reaction had consequences. Next, we discover how the town's escalating fear leads to unpredictable decisions, and why even the Donnellys cannot fully anticipate the outcome, and how control, once exercised too broadly, can invite danger. Chapter 17. Chaos at the Edge. The town's fear was no longer contained. Reports of strange figures, shadows by the river, and lights moving unnaturally had escalated into whispers of panic. People avoided the river entirely, crossing fields instead, walking in small groups, talking too loudly to reassure themselves. Curiosity had shifted into something sharper, an almost desperate need to see, to confront, to understand. Inside the Donnelly farmhouse, Patrick paced silently. Margaret moved among the children, her hands trembling just slightly. The children were alert, their eyes scanning the windows and walls as if the house itself could sense the town's growing tension. "They're pushing too close," Margaret said softly. "What if someone breaks through?" Patrick did not answer immediately. His gaze held steady on the distant lights of the town. "Then we respond. Calmly, precisely. Everything else is noise." That night, a group of townsfolk ventured closer than they ever had before, lanterns swinging, voices hushed but determined. They were no longer curious. They were seeking answers. And the river, once silent, reflected the weight of their intent. The eldest child noticed them first. A subtle gesture, barely perceptible, signaled the others. They moved along the edge of the river, shadows among shadows, leaving deliberate traces that confused and misdirected. One misstep, one hesitation, could have revealed them entirely. But they did not falter. Inside, Patrick whispered, "Fear is now a tool. Use it carefully. Let them see what you want them to see." Margaret watched, uneasy. "Do we risk too much?" Patrick's voice was steady. "Only what is necessary." The townsfolk paused, trying to interpret the movements they glimpsed. Their brains tried to fill the gaps, but every assumption they made led to doubt. Some believed they had seen figures split in two. Others thought reflections moved against the current. No one could be certain of anything. If you're following the story, this is where perception becomes power. Observation is no longer passive, it shapes reality itself. The Donnellys had learned this, and now the town was living inside it, whether it knew it or not. By the river, tension stretched taut, lanterns swung, shadows danced, and hearts raced. The children remained unseen, yet every subtle ripple of movement forced the town to reconsider what they thought they knew. Back in the farmhouse, Patrick addressed the children. Tonight, you learned the first rule of escalation. Even chaos can be guided. The children nodded, understanding the balance between subtlety and influence. Every observer, every whisper, every footstep was part of the pattern. The town had crossed a line. The Donnellys had responded. The stage was set for the next confrontation, one that could no longer be contained in whispers or shadows. Next, we discover how the town's escalating actions provoked the Donnellys into a move that could change everything, and why even careful patterns can unravel unexpectedly, and how fear, once shaped, can demand consequences beyond anyone's control. Chapter 18. The Move That Changed Everything. The town had grown bold. After weeks of quiet observation, whispers and small confrontations, some residents decided they would not be deterred. Lanterns swung across the riverbank as they approached the edge of the Donnelly property. Curiosity had turned into intent. The sheriff trailed behind, notebook clutched tightly, eyes scanning every shadow. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick and Margaret had anticipated this escalation. The children gathered silently, listening to every creak, every distant footstep. The plan had to unfold perfectly. Any error now could expose everything. Patrick spoke softly to the eldest child. Tonight, you act. Subtle, deliberate. Guide their attention, shape their fear. Do not let them see what they cannot understand. The eldest nodded. We will. Carefully. Outside, the first figure stepped onto the bank. The eldest child moved silently into position, just out of sight. A shadow fell across the water. The ripple in the river distorted reflections. One by one, the children manipulated what the town could perceive. Every movement, every subtle flicker, choreographed to mislead. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, unsure of what they were seeing. Some thought they glimpsed multiple figures where there were none. Others swore the shadows moved against the natural flow of the water. Confusion took hold. Patrick observed from the window. Notice how quickly doubt spreads, he said to Margaret. She nodded, her face tense. But if one of them acts rashly, all of this could collapse. Inside, the children moved with precision. Their steps were measured, their gestures were minimal, and yet the impact was enormous. The town's confidence faltered. They questioned what they had witnessed, their assumptions unraveling faster than they could react. If you're still following the story, understand this. Perception is a weapon. Control it carefully, and even the boldest observers can be manipulated. The Donnellys had honed this for generations. Now, the town was living inside their design. The sheriff paused, lantern raised, notebook open, but nothing made sense. Patterns contradicted reality, shadows defied logic. Even the adults in the crowd were unnerved. Back inside, Margaret whispered, "We've done it. For now." Patrick nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the river. "For now," he echoed. "They will test us again. Every move is a prelude to another. Control is never permanent." The town left, unsettled, whispering and second-guessing. The Donnellys returned to quiet observation, knowing that their influence had reached a new level, but the next challenge was already forming. Next, we discover how the town escalates in response to the Donnellys' subtle manipulations, and why the family must confront not just fear, but consequence, and how even a perfectly controlled pattern can ignite chaos. Chapter 19. The Edge of Exposure. The town's patience had run thin. After weeks of whispers, shadows, and manipulated perceptions, fear had grown into defiance. A small group of townsfolk, led by the sheriff, decided to confront what they believed was the source, the Donnelly family. Lanterns swung, footsteps crunched over frost-hardened earth, and the cold Montana wind carried anxious murmurs. Inside the Donnelly house, Patrick and Margaret sensed the shift immediately. The children were alert, their eyes scanning windows, doors, and every shadow outside. The balance they had maintained for generations, control, observation, subtle influence, was about to be tested in a way they had never experienced. Patrick whispered, "They will come closer tonight. Stay calm. Step carefully." The eldest child nodded. "We can manage. But for how long?" The youngest shuffled slightly, clutching a small bundle of objects the family had used for decades. Markers, shadows, reflections, tools of manipulation, tools of survival. Outside, the townsfolk paused near the riverbank. They had seen the lights, the figures, the shadows that defied explanation. Their curiosity now collided with fear, and they were determined to push through both. Patrick moved silently to the window. Observe their movement. Let them think they see, then guide them. The children positioned themselves along the riverbank, shadows blending with darkness, reflections dancing on the water's surface. Every step, every subtle gesture was designed to confuse and control. The townsfolk gasped, whispered and stumbled, unsure of what was real. The sheriff scribbled furiously in his notebook, eyes narrowing. "This can't be natural," he muttered. But he could not explain the illusions, the patterns, or the feeling that the house and the river were conspiring against him. Margaret's voice broke the tension briefly. "They are testing their limits. But what if someone steps too far?" Patrick's gaze remained steady. "Then we respond, not with fear, but with guidance. Control is not about preventing observation, it's about shaping it. If you're following closely, this is the moment suspense peaks. The Donnellys' careful orchestration collides with human curiosity. Observation becomes challenge, fear becomes action." Suddenly, one of the townsfolk moved too quickly, lantern light reflecting off the water. A ripple spread unnaturally. The children froze, then adjusted, shifting shadows and movements with precision. The town hesitated, unsure if what they saw was real or constructed. Patrick whispered to the children, "Remember, exposure is dangerous. One misstep, and patterns collapse." The group slowly withdrew, unsettled and bewildered. The sheriff's notebook was full, yet clarity remained impossible. The Donnellys had controlled the narrative for now, but the edge of exposure had been reached. Next, we discover how the final confrontation approaches, and why even a family who controls everything can face consequences beyond their design, and how fear, observation, and human error combine to change the pattern forever. Chapter 20. The Pattern Unraveled. The night hung heavier than any before. The town had gathered at the riverbank, drawn by rumors and fear. Lanterns flickered across frozen ground. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. The sheriff stood at the edge, notebook in hand, aware that tonight could define everything. Inside the Donnelly farmhouse, Patrick and Margaret moved quietly. The children were ready, their eyes sharp, bodies still yet alert. Every year, every lesson, every subtle movement had led to this moment. Their world was precise, controlled, calculated. But control has limits. The eldest child whispered, "They've pushed too far. We must act carefully, or they will force a mistake." Patrick nodded. "Remember everything, every reflection, every shadow, every pause. This is our final pattern." Outside, the first townsfolk stepped too close. Lanterns caught on branches, illuminating movement that was not there. The children shifted, creating reflections and shadows that danced across the water, shapes that confused, misled, and disoriented. The sheriff scribbled in the notebook, frustration building. Nothing made sense. Every observation contradicted the last. Patterns folded into illusions, fear, carefully guided, had become chaos. Suddenly, one misstep. A lantern dropped, shattering the illusion for a moment. The townsfolk gasped. Shadows shifted too fast. The children froze, instinctively responding, adjusting, controlling again. Patrick whispered, "Focus. Every movement is deliberate. We survive by shaping perception." Margaret held the youngest close. "Even control has a limit, Patrick. Even perfection." Her words hung in the cold Montana air. For the first time, the family realized that even their careful orchestration could be broken, not by strength, not by fear, but by the unpredictability of human error. The town hesitated. Some flews, some remained, mesmerized and terrified. Observation had become mutual. The watchers were now part of the pattern, and the pattern had changed. By dawn, the riverbank was quiet. The Donnellys retreated inside. The town had witnessed enough to know something extraordinary existed, yet they could not explain it. Fear remained, but the edge of chaos had passed. Control was tenuous now. Patrick turned to the children. Tonight you learned the final lesson. Even patterns, no matter how perfect, are vulnerable once seen. Remember that. Margaret nodded, exhausted. And yet, we survive. The children understood. Observation shapes perception, but unpredictability defines reality. Even a family who controls generations of patterns must respect the limits of human and natural error. The town slowly recovered, whispers lasting for years. No one could prove anything. Some claimed the Donnellys had vanished that night. Others said the family remained, watching silently, always guiding perception, always shaping fear. And the river kept flowing, carrying reflections, shadows, and stories the world could never fully understand. The end.